having a background in computer science, some of you know I also have a strong background in technical theater. And something I remember, yes, we have some technical theater people in the house. Something I remember is how the actors, and I was an actor occasionally, we would get all the glory, but without the technical theater people, we would not be heard, we would not be seen, we would not be dressed, etc. So I want everyone to take a moment and acknowledge how many technical people are making this conference happen. Let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you. Now, 10 years ago, I started my journey with open source software, and I remember being so inspired by the open source dream. The dream was that someday, somehow, everyone would be using open source software. They'd be using it in their businesses, in their homes, in governments, in schools, and so much more. That was a dream 10 years ago. Now, in 2019, that dream has become reality. Congratulations, we won. Open source software is used across industries and across the world. And this has happened so much faster than I think any of us expected. What we failed to plan for, however, is what would come next. Now that the world runs on open source software, how do we make it sustainable so the world keeps running on open source software? It turns out, even when dreams come true, there's still a lot of work involved afterward. Creating and maintaining open source is still really hard. It involves so much more than releasing the code on GitHub. It is one thing to upload a project to GitHub and call it open source. It is quite another to commit to governing that project over its lifetime. Even when you have just one open source project, governing it is difficult. It's even harder when you are dealing with a massive number of projects and how they relate to each other. How they relate to each other not just on the technical level, but also on the humanity and community level. Sometimes when I talk about how difficult this is, people ask me, well, if governing open source is so hard, why do you do it? Why don't you just close the code and call it a day? Well, closing the code might be easier in the short term. But there are a lot of long-term benefits to practicing open source. Benefits that are not only beneficial to the businesses, but also the communities around those open source projects. One of the biggest reasons we practice open source at Chef is Chef the product, Chef the business, Chef the everything else it is would not exist without our open source community. Our community built the foundation upon which every part of Chef stands. That means when our community is successful, we are successful. When our community thrives, we thrive. Furthermore, open source communities produce better software. Software that is better at both the code level and at a user level. When we develop software as a community, we expand our reach of experiences. Bigger and smaller teams, different industries, bigger and smaller companies, different cultures, different values, and different needs. As Igor highlighted, we have so much international talent at this conference alone. Open source projects let us harness that talent of all these different perspectives. We bring in perspectives we never would have considered otherwise. The best way to create software is in close collaboration with the people who use it. When we practice open source, we create software not just for our user base, we create software with our user base. And our software is so much better for that. Because we believe this so strongly, Chef recently made the decision to open source 100% of our major product code. All of the code for Chef's major products is now available on GitHub for anyone to view, fork, modify, and contribute to. When this decision was made, before we announced it publicly, my boss came to me one day, told me about the decision, and told me, figure out how to make this work. I'm both an Has anyone else had your boss come to you and experience that? Figure out how to make it work on both an engineering and a community level. And in the process, we discovered something that surprised almost everyone, including me. Chef already had over 1,000 open source projects. Our open source footprint was already massive, and it was only going to get bigger with this change. we quickly realized we needed a way to govern our projects at this massive scale, to guide and execute on their evolution and growth. We knew that technology would be part of the solution, but we also knew we could not solve this problem with technology alone. The reason open source governance is so hard is because it sits here at the intersection of humanity and technology. And that's a tricky intersection to navigate. What's more, you will never be done with navigating this intersection. It will change as technologies change and as people change. Where it gets even more complicated is when you have multiple open source projects. This means you have multiple intersections that must all be navigated as they constantly change. And when you have multiple projects, you have exponential relationships and dependencies among all those projects. Without careful effort, this will get unmanageable very fast. This was a scary thing to realize for us, but I also took some comfort knowing we are not alone in this struggle. The struggle we are facing is the same one the larger open source world is facing. We have all of this open source software out there. We're only going to be adding more as time goes on, and this is only going to get harder. We needed a way to make this sustainable for us as a business, for our contributors, our community, our users, and more. In the process of figuring that out, we discovered what I call the 3 duties of open source governance, which apply to any project and at any scale. And the first of these is to automate the correct things. Notice I said automate the correct things. I did not say automate everything. Humans must still be involved for an open source project to function and grow. The real purpose of automation is to free up humans to do what they do best. And we'll cover a lot of examples of that in just a bit. The next duty is to keep both users and contributors engaged. It doesn't matter how good your open source project is if no one is using it and no one is contributing to it. Communities must be deliberately engaged in order to stay healthy and in order to keep those projects healthy. And that brings us to the third duty, which is to avoid burnout. And this is the one I have personally struggled with the most. Burnout is an epidemic in the open source community. Even though the entire world is using open source software, many projects are still being maintained by people on their own time. Burnout among open source maintainers will become toxic to the entire project, and it must be intercepted and dealt with before it gets to that point. And we'll cover exactly how you do that. Before we dive into these duties, let's briefly pause and cover who I am. I'm Nell Shamrell-Harrington. I'm a principal engineer at Chef. I'm also the community engineering lead at Chef, which means I oversee all of our open source efforts. I'm the co-host of the Adventures in DevOps podcast. I'm also a longtime open source contributor and maintainer. If you want to live tweet at me during this or at any time afterwards, my Twitter handle is my name, @NellShamrell. And with that, let's dive into that first duty, which is to automate the correct things. Automation is extremely helpful with large distributed groups of volunteers, especially when they are technical volunteers. Having correct automation means volunteers can be more autonomous. They can do more things on their own, and they can contribute value to your projects faster and more reliably. The purpose of automating the correct things is to free up humans to do what they do best. And what humans do best is make judgment calls. A lot of the job of being an open source maintainer is making judgment calls based on my context and the context of my fellow maintainers, as well as the context of my larger community. These judgment calls are something that cannot yet be automated, and I honestly don't think they should be. The whole point of using automation is to automate those things that humans do not need to be involved in, so we get to the point where we're ready to make judgment calls faster and more reliably. One automation technique we use at Chef is issue templates. Whenever someone opens a new issue on one of our projects, they see a template which indicates exactly what information we need from them in order to troubleshoot the issue. This includes details of their technical setup, replication steps for the bug, and more. The idea behind using these templates is to make sure we get all the relevant information up front, rather than needing to go back and forth, often across multiple time zones. This saves a lot of time for all involved and gets us, the maintainers, to the point of making a judgment call on how the issue should be handled much faster. Similar to issue templates, pull request templates are also very useful automation. Anytime a user opens a pull request on one of our projects, they see another template which indicates exactly what information we need in order to evaluate that pull request. Again, it's so much easier to communicate what we need up front rather than having to go back and forth for several days with someone who might be in a very different time zone. This, again, gets us to the point of making a judgment call on whether to merge the pull request or not much faster. Another example of correct automation, which works very well on pull requests, is linters. Linters are programs that scan code for common errors. They're a fantastic example of automation that prevents a lot of arguments on pull requests. I often tell the story of the time I worked on a team where I had two engineers fighting over white space. And this was not a white space specific language. One would change it one way, one would change it back the other. The commit history would all be white space changes. And what this did was it wasted a lot of time and kept us from getting to the other higher priority things that were needed for the business to function. I've used linters ever since because they are a way we can set standards for our code up front, and then they become kind of an impartial mediator, saying this part of the code fits the standards, this part of the code doesn't, please fix these parts of the code. It's a lot easier for people to blame the machine than to blame another human being. Now, another great system of automation is CI/CD systems like Travis CI or Circle CI. When a project uses one of these services, it will build and run tests on every pull request, then display the results of those tests on the pull request itself. This lets contributors be autonomous. They can find out immediately or very quickly on their own whether their code passes the tests or not. And what I love most about these is it's a great way to avoid those dreaded words, but the test passes on my machine. At this point, we've seen several examples of correct automation, but that brings us to another question. Where should the automation end, and where should a human come into the process? Again, humans come in when it's time to make a judgment call about an issue or pull request. And working in open source involves making a lot of judgment calls. And no matter what call you make, there will be someone who is not happy about the result. That's the reality of working with other human beings. The best way to manage this is to always be very clear about why you make a certain decision. When a GitHub issue is open on one of my projects, the judgment call I need to make and communicate is this issue something the project should address? Occasionally people open an issue thinking they're seeing a bug, but it is actually intended behavior, just intended behavior that did not manifest in the way they expected it to. When I'm evaluating an issue as a maintainer, I need to consider the project's intent. Is what is reported in the issue intended behavior or not? And if we change that behavior, will that potentially alter the project's intent? These are all things that I, the human, need to weigh. If the judgment call is yes, this issue is something the project should address, I, the maintainer, then need to decide if it's something that should be addressed now or something that should wait. This involves looking at the full context of work that's already ongoing. Sometimes I can address an issue immediately if it does not conflict with in-flight work or already prioritized work. Sometimes, however, I need to wait until certain things are done or certain decisions are made before I can start work on that issue. No matter what my judgment call is, I then need to communicate it in a clear and supportive way. And we'll go over how you do that in just a moment. Pull requests involve making similar judgment calls. When I'm evaluating a pull request, there's one ultimate question that I need to answer. Does this contribution add value to the project? Will this be a net positive or a net negative if it's merged into the pull request? And if it does add value, if the answer is yes, is merging it the right thing to do in the context of where the project is at this time? One of the big reasons a human needs to make this call about value rather than a machine is even when something is the superior option from a purely technical standpoint, It still may not be the best thing for that project at that time. I've seen people open pull requests that change frameworks, that change libraries, or sometimes even the coding languages themselves that are used in the project. And these updates, you can make an argument that they are the superior option purely from a technical standpoint, but they're not the right fit for the current skill sets of the people who already work on the project. Something to remember whenever you're evaluating a pull request, whether it's internally or externally, is a contribution returns negative value when it makes other contributions harder. I'm on the core team of the Chef Habitat project, which is written in the Rust programming language. A few years ago, a new version of Rust's automated code formatter was released, and someone immediately ran it on the entire code base and submitted a giant pull request that changed nearly every file. Now at this point, when they submitted that pull request, we had a lot of work already in progress. If I had merged it, that would have caused massive merge conflicts across a lot of people's work, and it would have made the in-progress work harder and take much more time to complete. And therefore, if I had merged it at that time, it would have returned negative value, which made us decide to hold off from it. Now, not everyone in the community agreed with this, but this was the right decision for the project in where it was at that time. Now, when a judgment call is made, especially when it's one that might be controversial, it is vital to communicate it clearly to all contributors and users. This leads us to the next duty of open source governance, which is to keep both your users and your contributors engaged with your project. This is critical because open source projects live and die by community engagement. Again, it really doesn't matter how good your project is if people don't use it and contribute to it. That's how projects rot and die. The best way to keep people engaged is pretty straightforward. Respond to them when they reach out, especially on issues and pull requests. I have found, in open source communities at least, any response is better than no response. Even if it's a response that says, thank you, we received this, we're not able to look at it at this time, but we'll get back to you within a week. Even when someone opens an issue and it's something I can't address, or someone opens a pull request and it's something I can't merge, I still need to say so both directly and supportively. The best and simplest way to do this is something we all learned in kindergarten. Always, always, always say thank you for any open source contribution. Even if it's something I cannot address or use, I must recognize that someone went through the time and effort to put it together and submit it. If anything, it shows they took an interest in my project and wanted to be a part of it. When you say thank you, contributors are much more likely to come back. Even if it's a pull request that cannot be merged, they're likely to learn from that experience and come back and contribute more value. Additionally, when you say thank you, it is always vital to always, always, always say why. There is little more frustrating for a contributor than to spend a lot of time and effort on a pull request and have it just be closed without any explanation of why. Sometimes a pull request needs to be closed because of a technical reason. Sometimes it's because it conflicts with in-flight work, and sometimes, again, it just isn't the right thing for the project at that time. Regardless of the reason, you must always give your contributors the benefit of knowing why their work was not merged. As you can imagine, when you have over 1,000 projects, responding to every issue and every pull request is a big challenge. And there are a few techniques we use to make it easier. And the first one is what we call response time maximums. Every major project at Chef has a maximum time for response to issues and pull requests. Now notice I said response. I did not say resolution. That is going to vary a lot depending on the project and depending on the context of the issue or pull request. However, no matter what the nature of the request, it needs a response from a human being within a certain time maximum. This ensures that the person who opened the issue or pull request knows that a human being has at least seen it and acknowledged it. And when it comes to pull requests across 1,000 different projects, remembering which ones need to be reviewed and which ones need to be followed up on is also a big challenge. Fortunately, there is a tool that helps us with this. Pull Reminders is a Slack plugin. I believe it was acquired by GitHub a few months ago, and it scans GitHub repos for pull requests and then sends daily reminders to whoever is assigned to review them. It's honestly a really nice way to start my morning. I get a report of everything I need to review and everything that I need to follow up on. Pull reminders is another example of correct automation. It's an automated tool, but it is one that is meant to remind people that they need to interact with contributors on a human level. This is important because people don't, yet at least, feel the same engagement with a machine or a bot as they do with a fellow human. The best thing about open source, it really isn't the technology that results from it. It's the collaboration and learning process that takes place among real people. As you interact with your community and you provide feedback to them, they will also interact with and provide feedback to you. Something I learned the hard way is when I ask someone for feedback, there are two ways they might interpret that question. Some interpret it as me asking for information. This is really useful when I need to make a decision about the direction of a project. I want to know beforehand how that decision will affect people's workflows. This informs both the decision I end up making and the implementation of that decision, and it's extremely useful. Others, however, interpret me asking them for feedback as me asking them for permission to do something. They feel their role is to decide for the maintainer, not to inform the decision that that maintainer makes. Some projects do operate in this way. They try to get a community consensus anytime they make a change, but I have seen so many of them become paralyzed when, for whatever reason, a consensus just cannot be reached, but something has to be done. The reason I bring both these interpretations up is before you seek feedback from anyone, you need to know what type of feedback you seek and set expectations for that up front. Once you know the type of feedback you're looking for, there are a few different ways to go about gathering it. One of the ways we at Chef engage with our community is through our community Slack channels and forums, as well as through in-person events. It generates a lot of goodwill when a community member can interact directly with a Chef engineer or with a product manager. It's amazing how much we learn not just about how our community members use Chef products, but who they are as a person, which forms a stronger connection with them. One of the best ways to retain community members is to form and maintain those personal connections. These community spaces are great places to get informal feedback, but sometimes I need something a little more formal, especially when I want to see all the input aggregated into one place. In these cases, community surveys are very helpful. We did one of these last year to help us better understand how to direct our efforts around Chef community cookbooks. The results of the survey helped us figure out what we needed to address immediately, what could wait, and what we didn't need to worry about. This helped us set priorities informed by data. And if anyone ever questioned the priorities, we could point them directly to the data from the survey. The other nice thing about surveys is they ensure that we get a lot of voices participating in them, including voices we may not hear from very often in the community spaces. When you are looking for feedback, there's always the danger that you will only hear the loudest voices and the loudest opinions, which may not be the voices and opinions of everyone involved in it. When someone receives a survey link from us, everyone has an equal opportunity to make their voices heard, and it gives all voices a chance to be expressed and to be heard. Both community spaces and surveys work really well for gathering feedback on things that are already public. But when you are a business that practices open source, there will be times you need feedback on things that are not yet public. In situations like this, it's worked very well for us to reach out to groups of community members and bring them in under NDA, or non-disclosure agreements. This allows us to brief them on the change we're going to make, get their feedback before revealing things publicly, and this will inform our decision and especially how we execute those decisions. I'm proud to say that no community member that I brought in under a community member NDA has ever broken their NDA at Chef. A nice side effect of bringing people in under these non-disclosure agreements is it lets them know how much we value them, how much we trust them, and how much we value their perspective on the work we do. They are a very valued community member to us, and we want their perspective when we're planning on how to do something. Seeing how we trust them builds a lot of goodwill and drives even better engagement. The ultimate goal of feedback is to make sure we serve our community in the best possible way. Something to remember, no matter how you ask for feedback, it's crucial to set boundaries around when you are available for feedback and when you are not. I have seen maintainers trying to answer questions in community chat channels at all hours and everything in real time. This isn't healthy, and they've burned out horrendously by trying to do this. You must set times when you will be present, communicate those, then disconnect when it is not those times. And this brings us to our third duty of open source governance, which is to avoid burnout, both of yourself and others. Several years ago, I was working an extremely stressful tech job while also working on open source on my nights and weekends. And for months, I could feel this pressure building in my head and in my chest. It was a physical sensation. And as the stress magnified and the exhaustion got worse, the pain only got worse. One morning, my wife came into the bathroom of our apartment and found me collapsed on the floor with symptoms of a heart attack. Now, I was 28 and in pretty good physical condition, so this was really bizarre. She got me to the hospital, they did an EKG, they did several other tests, and what they discovered was it wasn't actually a heart attack, it was a panic attack that manifested like a heart attack. And something I found is this is not uncommon, especially in the tech industry, but I did not want to talk about this with anyone initially, let alone in a public forum like this. This is actually the first time I've ever talked about this in a public forum. The reason is I was scared that people would think I was just not strong enough to handle the pressure and wouldn't want to give me those difficult assignments. What I realized recently, however, is burnout does not mean we are not mentally strong enough. Burnout means we are too strong. We are so strong mentally that we will overrule every signal our body sends us to get in that one more code commit, to get that one more issue triage, to get that one more pull request reviewed. This means the only way our body can get our attention is through shutting down. Many of us push so hard because we fear letting our communities of users and contributors down. The truth, however, is if you attempt to push through burnout or attempt to push others through burnout, everyone will lose. Including you, including the people close to you, including users of your project, and more. It is not possible to push through burnout and come out on the other side okay. If you keep trying to do this, your project will burn out your maintainers and it will not be an active project for much longer. Additionally, burnout is not only a danger to the individual person burning out, it's also a danger to the project itself and the project's owners, especially if that project is owned by a business. Oftentimes, people burn out because they are the only one who knows how to do something, and they have to keep doing it over and over at tremendous personal cost. We heard a bit about the Phoenix project yesterday. This is like a Brent situation. If someone needs to suddenly exit your project, whether for burnout or for other reasons, there is a major risk that critical information, and even more importantly, context for that information, will be lost. If you care about your project, if you care about your business, if you care about your community, you must care about it continuing in a healthy way. That's the only way it can be sustainable and the only way it can have lasting success. There are some techniques that help with this. At Chef, every major project has at least 2 owners and multiple approvers and reviewers. This makes it so one person is not the single point of failure for any of our major projects. Additionally, it makes it so people know where to go if they have questions or need context about something in your project. Another technique, if you find yourself in a situation where information only lives in one person's head, is to record their screen. When I'm on a project and only one person knows how to do something, they usually don't have time to document it or teach someone else to do it because they're having to do it so much. A good first step, and I've had maintainers do this, is I ask them to record their screen of their computer. Just pull up QuickTime, hit screen record. It doesn't need to have video. All I want to see is a captured video of what they're doing on their screen. If they're in a shell, what commands are they running? This allows that knowledge to, at least of how to do that task, to live somewhere other than that person's head, and it puts it in a place where we can analyze it, we can document it, we can refer to it at least if something happens to that person. The information at the very least will be captured in one other place other than their head. Now, a good next step after screen recordings is to do formal knowledge sharing sessions and record them. That way you not only get the pure information about how something is done, you also get the context of why it is done that way. And sometimes when you have more people with the context of why, you realize there may be better ways to do those tasks so they don't always fall on one person. For any business, for any project, for any organization, your information and your context for that information are your superpowers. They are way too valuable to only be known by one person. And please don't ever put that burden on anyone. I've been that person who is the only one who knows how to do something. Always remember this. When someone tells you they are burning out, they're probably pretty far along in the burnout process already. It is imperative to listen, to take it seriously, and take action. This can include taking some of their in-progress work off their shoulders. It can include doing a screencast. It can include bringing in someone to pair with them or just to observe them so there's some knowledge transfer and more. The most critical thing to do is to respond immediately. Don't ask them to push through it and promise that things will magically get better soon. They very rarely do. Again, you cannot push through burnout. You cannot push someone else through burnout. It will become toxic, and it will eventually take your contributors and your project down if it is not fixed. This is the most important duty of these 3 duties. And let's review them again. The 3 duties of any open source project at any scale are to automate the correct things, keep users and contributors engaged, and avoid burnout. Focusing on these, putting them at the forefront of all of your innovation, will set you up for phenomenal success in your open source efforts and beyond. As we wrap up, there are a few things I hope you take with you. And the first is that dreams do come true. Disney had it right all along, it turns out. The whole world is now running on open source software and libraries. However, even when dreams come true, we can't stop there. We get to define what happens next. Now that we have a world using open source software, we need to figure out how to make it sustainable so it continues to evolve as technology evolves, as humanity evolves. As we evolve, we are going to need more software. We're going to need better software, and open source communities produce better software. Something I often tell people about, I was literally on a call with a major in the US Marine Corps recently, and I said to him, the thing is, all the problems that could be solved by one person at a computer in their basement going on a coding binge, those have already been solved. Those were the easy parts. We're at the hard stuff now, and solving the hard problems requires collaboration. In order to foster this collaboration, you need to navigate this intersection of humanity and technology with governance. This is critical at any scale. And I'll be honest with you, it will never be easy, but it is possible. If anyone ever tells you if you buy this one appliance and put it in your data center, or you buy this other solution, it will magically make all your open source work easy or all your DevOps work easy, they are lying to you. It's never going to be easy, but what I hope this talk leaves you with is the realization that this is something you and any project or any company can do. The thing is, you must be deliberate about it in order to keep it sustainable. If you're curious about learning more about how we govern over 1,000 projects at Chef, we have open sourced our open source process on GitHub. We call it our book of open source. The reason this is on GitHub is it's a living document. We in our community are iterating on it and changing it as we learn. If you're interested in being involved, please feel free to open an issue or open a pull request or reach out to me however you prefer. Every one of us has the potential to continue fulfilling the dream of open source together. Thank you.